Tiana God, hello all. Good afternoon, and what thank you for watching. So this is day 21 of reading Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell. Conquest. While European imperialism has been dominant in the past 500 years, in the preceding centuries, Europe was itself subjected to foreign conquests. It was invaded from Asia by the Mongols, to whom the Russians paid tribute. It was invaded from the Middle East by the Ottoman Empire, whose armies reached the gates of Vienna in the 16th century. Europe was invaded from North Africa, and the whole Iberian, Iberian Peninsula was subjugated for centuries by the Moors, M-O-O-R-S. There was nothing peculiarly European about either conquering or being conquered, or about changing from one of these rules to the other in the course of history. The year in which the last of the North African conquerors was driven out of Spain, 1492, was the same year that marked the beginning of Europeans' creation of worldwide empires. Conquest, like slavery, existed on every inhabited continent and involved all the races of mankind as both conquerors and subjugated peoples. Slavery and conquest existed in the Western Hemisphere before the first white man set foot on the shores of the Americas. The Zulus were conquering other African peoples when the British arrived in southern Africa and conquered them all. Europeans also displaced other conquerors in Asia and among the Polynesians. What was different about European imperialism was how widely scattered its empires were, which was possible only because of revolutions in naval technology and a pre-existing base of wealth available to finance overseas expansion. But morally, what the Europeans did was the same as what non-Europeans had been doing for thousands of years. This is not a moral justification for either, but it is an argument against the selective localization of evil. Against that background, it is possible to see what a gross distortion of history it is for schools to be asking American school children such questions as how they would feel if they were the indigenous American Indians being forced from their land by the westward movement of invaders from Europe. These children, with no historical background and coming from a society which condemns conquest, cannot possibly recreate the attitudes and beliefs which prevailed among either the Indians or the Europeans of earlier centuries. Exactly. While today's American children would, of course, think it wrong to take other people's lands by force, the American Indians had no such conception and took one another's lands by force long before they ever laid eyes on a white man. That is true. Indeed, Indians often joined with the European invaders to attack other Indians in order to share in the spoils or to exact revenge for these other Indians' prior spoliation, spoliation of them, including the taking of their lands and the enslavement of their people. Yes. When Cortez marched against the Aztec capital of, Tenochtitlan, I can't, Tenochtitlan, Tenochtitlan, he led an army of 900 Spaniards and thousands of Indians. Say that 5 times fast, by the way, that word. So here we go. No doubt those Indians forced off their lands in the United States or Brazil were bitter at being on the losing end of so many battles, but that is wholly different from a belief that battles were not the way to settle such things. No one wants to be conquered or enslaved, but that is wholly different from not wanting to be a conqueror or enslaver, or thinking that either or both are morally wrong. This is not a question of moral relativism or situational ethics. We may today condemn all conquest at all periods of history, but that is wholly different from imagining that such feelings were those of Indians in centuries past. Clearly such, how would you feel, in quotes, how would you feel, end quote, questions are put to American children and adults to advance a contemporary vision and a contemporary agenda rather than to provide a realistic understanding of history. That's true. It is a betrayal of the trust of those who send their children to school to be educated, not manipulated. Exactly. My gosh. Studying Western imperialism in isolation from other non-Western imperialism, such as that of Genghis Khan or the Ottoman Turks, makes all the injustices, oppressions, and horrors incident to imperialism itself seem like depravities peculiar to the West. The tendentiousness. Tendentiousness? I've never heard that before. Tendentiousness. Dang, that's a mouthful. Of such a view of history stands out particularly when efforts are made to depict the United States as especially guilty of sins common to the human race around the world. That's what I've always heard. Don't give me that crap that everybody was doing it and stuff. And it's like, you don't understand. That was literally the way of life, right? Like, come on. Looking back on it now, hindsight is 2020, right? But back then, it was commonplace. Anyway, one such history after mentioning the Americans, and they weren't the first nor the last to do it, by the way. In quotes, was it resting? WRESTING, the island remnants of Spain's empire in the Pacific and Caribbean. I've never heard of it like that, but anyway, end quote, during the Spanish-American War, declared that, in quotes, Russians were not comparably aggressive overseas, end quote. This was said not by a street corner demagogue, but by an academic scholar at a prestigious university. Russians, in reality, conquered vastly more area than the United States ever did and continued to conquer after the United States began to withdraw from its few colonies. The difference was not in how, quote-unquote, aggressive Americans were, but in the fact that the United States had a powerful navy and the Russians did not, so that the Russian Empire expanded through land conquest of contiguous territory. The word, quote-unquote, overseas allows the author an escape hatch, but the word, quote-unquote, aggressive describes an attitude, not a capability. The prevalence of European imperialism in general sense in 16th century is likewise due to special capabilities rather than special attitudes. Whatever their attitudes may have been in the Middle Ages, Europeans lacked the military and economic capabilities required to become imperial powers on the world stage, just as most non-European countries have lacked that capability since then. The history of which peoples, nations, or civilizations have conquered or enslaved which other peoples, nations, or civilizations has been largely a history of who has been in a position to do so. That's absolutely true. You know, I wonder if there was ever a civilization that did not do that. You know what I mean? Like, I was thinking, is there? Because, like, I mean, I didn't know, you know, like, well, I mean, of course, you'd have to go on the people that can only have, like, records of things that survived and whatnot or whatever. But I just was wondering, just then as I was reading that, is there a civilization that does not act like this? I mean, come on. Western cultural values, the misuse of history to condemn evils common around the world as if they were peculiarities of the West, has serious practical implications. Two wrongs don't make a right, but undermining the society which has a smaller evil only makes it more vulnerable to the greater evils in other societies and in international terrorist networks. Far more is involved than questions of objectivity or honesty, important as such questions are, which understanding the features of one's own society that have provided a prosperity, a freedom, and a security rare to non-existent over much of the rest of the world. Exactly. One risks losing by default all these things for oneself and posterity. American society is one whose underlying bases are always under attack by both internal opportunists and external enemies. Excuse me, those who have no conception of the Constitution of the United States except as an object for nitpicking cannot be expected to defend its integrity against the inevitable encroachments of political opportunists and judicial power seekers. Those who have no conception of the unique heritage of Western civilization have no idea of what losing that heritage would mean to them and to generations yet unborn, and why it must be defended against passing fads at home and lethal threats from abroad. Freedom is one of those values of Western civilization whose uniqueness has been aptly highlighted by Professor Orlando Patterson of Harvard. For most of human history, and for nearly all of the non-Western world prior to Western contact, freedom was, and for many still remains, anything but an obvious or desirable goal. Other values and ideals were or are of far greater importance to them, values such as the pursuit of glory, honor, and power for oneself or one's family, and clan nationalism, and imperial grandeur militarism, and valor in warfare, filial piety, Filialpiety, the harmony of heaven and earth, the spreading of the quote-unquote true faith, nirvana, hedonism, altruism, justice, equality, material progress. The list is endless, but almost never outside the context of Western culture and its influence has it included freedom. Indeed, non-Western peoples have thought so little about freedom that most human languages did not even possess a word for the concept before contact with the West. It would take a vast study to elaborate the benefits that the West has created for itself and for the world. Advances in science, technology, and medicine are some of the more obvious, but Western advances in the realm of ideas and institutions have been fundamental as well, though these have not always traveled as well when transplanted in cultures very different from the cultures in which these ideas and institutions evolved over the centuries. Here it may be useful to sketch two fundamental Western mental products and universalistic conception of human beings and the rule of law. Perhaps the most important and certainly the most distinctive characteristic of Western civilization since at least the 18th century has been a growing universalism. Nothing has been more common among human beings around the world and for thousands of years of history than to disregard the troubles inflicted on other people outside the group to which they happen to belong. Some have taken positive pleasure in their ability to dominate, oppress, humiliate, or kill others, as for example Genghis Khan did. I think I put a G on that. Genghis Khan did. The Mayans developed to a high art form both the prolonged tortures and humiliations that they heaped upon those they had conquered and the commemoration of such acts in their art. Nor had such things died out in the 20th century when the Japanese in World War II delighted in savaging and humiliating American and other prisoners of war. They did. As well as civilians in their conquered territories, and then their Nazi allies found mass slaughter not enough unless it was accomplished by soul-searing degradations inflicted on inmates of their concentration camps. No society thus far has entirely escaped this older tendency. In other words, universalism has not yet become universal in any society. And they did that to the people that they captured and took to Guantanamo Bay and like other places around like 9/11 time frame and everything, because they said that in order to like torture and like get the information out of them and everything, they had to humiliate them because like in ways that went, I guess, against their culture. Like I remember like making them expose themselves or whatever it was, putting them in like less than ideal positioning and whatnot, and I don't know. Hopefully it's changed, but I don't know. Nor did universalism in terms of having regard for other people's feeling or well-being imply any sense of equality and ability or even likability. It simply meant that all people deserved to be treated decently and fairly, whomever they might be, and whatever the state of their ability or their culture. Nothing epitomized this universalism more than Queen Victoria's concern about the fate of slaves in other lands. When Uncle Tom's Cabin, author Harriet Beecher Stowe, was granted an audience with Her Majesty during a trip to England, she found the Queen able to discuss the Dred Scott case, Dredscott case, in quotes, in great detail, end quote, as well as saying that she had wept over some of the passages in the novel. There could hardly be a greater social distance than that between the ruler of the largest empire the world had ever known and a slave being whipped in another country on the other side of an ocean. Yet this universalism was more than an incidental phenomenon in Western civilization. It fueled a worldwide crusade against slavery for more than a century, and the fact that it took more than a century to destroy slavery over most of the world clearly indicates that this universalism did not prevail outside of Western civilization. One of the implications of universalism is that those who are more fortunate need not be any more deserving than those in misery. For some, this suggests an imperative for redistribution of wealth, while like reparations, right? While for some others, it may suggest a sharing of the knowledge and the development of the habits, priorities, and values that would enable others to create wealth for themselves. For those who believe the latter, simply giving people things is counterproductive from the standpoint of getting them to become productive themselves. Nor is what is given likely to equal what the recipients could have created for themselves if the sources of productivity had been shared rather than the fruits. Like anything human, universalism can take foolish forms. And with the Australian woman who confused morality and causation, as so many others have done when seeking historical redress for historical abstractions at the expense of creating new problems for flesh and blood human beings. Another great Western advance had been the rule of law, again with universalism, not everywhere or at all times, but sufficiently to become a characteristic distinguishing Western from non-Western societies. Every society has its rules or its laws, but the rule of law implies far more than this. When the English beheaded King Charles I, this made unmistakably clear to all at the time and to the generations that followed throughout the English-speaking world that no one was above the law. Decades later, when Charles II learned that his subjects were reacting adversely to his expansive conception of his role as king, he found it prudent to sneak out of London in the middle of the night, cross the Channel to France, and never return to the British Isles. In many other societies, especially non-Western societies, the notion that the supreme ruler was subject to the law would be foreign, if not incomprehensible. In many of these societies, the ruler's word was itself law. The rule of law implies more than the principle that no one is above the law. It implies also that those with power cannot take action against individuals without some prior evidence of violations of existing laws and some prior determination through institutionally established, in quotes, quote unquote, due process, that the individual in question is in fact guilty of transgressing specific prohibitions. What this means for individual freedom and dignity can be illustrated by seeing what can happen in the absence of such safeguards. When Sultan Mehmed of the Ottoman Empire ordered one of his subjects to bring his adolescent son to him for his own sexual pleasure, holy shnikes, and the subject declined, they were both decapitated and their heads displayed before the Sultan at his banquet table. What? Western conceptions of the rule of law in general and the Constitution of the United States in particular reflect a vivid awareness of the dangers of power and the need to divide that power among different institutions that can counterbalance one another. I'm going to tell you, I was really trying to catch these gnats humanely and release them. But I'm thinking that may not be possible. Anyway, the principles implicit in the Constitution were made explicit in The Federalist, the collection of popular essays designed to explain the 18th century Americans. Okay, I'm gonna have to end it there. My son's calling me. Donde cohen que y en que chance que to me again. Love you, man.